I'm Dan Sohage, and I'm the director of Stand for All, and just want to take a moment to talk to you about asylum seekers, refugees, the law governing them, what's happening with the crossings in the channel, general information, very quickly, and very brief snapshot for you. Try and clear up some miscommunication and misinformation. Now, just want to apologise for the video. I'm using my phone at the moment, and there's some building work outside, so bear with me. Now, first off, asylum seekers and refugees are governed by what's known as the International Convention relating to the status of refugees. This is from 1951 and it still forms the basis of all international refugee law. It sets out who can actually be classed as a refugee. And where there's some miscommunication, moment and misunderstanding, is it doesn't mean that someone has to be fleeing a war zone. It's based on persecution, a well-founded fear for themselves. Now that could be religion, sexuality, gender, anything, political beliefs. And it's very individual, it's very subjective. You can have one person from a country who could become a refugee and have, be found to meet the criteria that they've crossed a border for, is one of the crucial ones. And nobody else from that country, in theory, because it is about their personal feelings of fear and persecution. And this sort of links in a bit with the argument at the moment of why don't they stay in France? It's a safe country. Well, safety is subjective. I feel safe in France. I love France. But for some people, and it's a very small proportion, I mean, we've got 4,100 crossings at the moment in the Channel this year. And France has about 150,000 plus asylum seekers. So it's a very small proportion. There are good reasons why they may not feel safe. France has been found to have breached refugees' rights and fined by the European Court of Human Rights for doing so, forcing them to sleep rough, depriving them of support. It's also been condemned and found to have breached reception conditions. This is where someone turns up, where an asylum seeker turns up in a country. The country is required to provide basic necessities and basic standard for them. France failed to do that. Police have been known to brutalise asylum seekers. And it's not just France. I mean, we see similar things happening throughout the EU, throughout the world. I mean, Germany has about 166,000+ asylum seekers. Last year they had 1,600 odd attacks against asylum seekers. So we can see why there is that fear. By the way, UK on the other hand has about 36,000+ asylum applications. And that number's not significantly changing at the moment. When we see people talk about the increase of crossings, we're not seeing a significant increase like that in the number of asylum applications overall. What we're seeing is people who, because of COVID-19, because of other options and other routes being closed to them, are having to take the only route left. And this is key, because crossing the Channel is not illegal. I mean, technically, all other things aside, I could do it today. It is not illegal to cross the Channel. The Channel is governed by international laws. It's neither illegal nor unlawful, and there's a bit of confusion between those two words to cross it. It's also not illegal to seek asylum. Indeed, in the convention I just mentioned, it is required that an asylum seeker is not penalised for their manner of entry. And that makes sense. I mean, if you're fleeing persecution, you can't exactly normally rock up at border control points. There are going to be times you have to find other routes to cross a border. So that's why that's included. You also probably might not have documentation. If you've had to pick up and leave, you might not have everything you need. You might not have a passport even. That requires a state to give it to you. If the state's persecuting you, you might not have one. So there's all these things going on. And that's where the context needs to be looked at. Because we hear things about first safe country. Well, as I said, what is safe? Safety is subjective. But also there's nothing in any international law that states that refugees have to stop in the first country they come to. Now, many do. 85% of all refugees live in developing countries in the region of origin, region of around where they've come from. So it's only a very small proportion, even so, 15% of all refugees across all the developed countries in the world. So we're not talking a significant proportion. But they do have to find other ways in, because we've closed what's known as safe routes. Now, the UK, for example, has 2 government-recognised routes to asylum, bringing people in. One is family reunification. It's been woefully misused and woefully underused. There was a thing called the Dubs Agreement, which set a target for how many unaccompanied minors would be brought in by the government to meet with their families. I mean, these are children without any support systems in refugee camps who have family here, family who are legally here, and the government was meant to bring over a certain number to repatriate with them. They didn't meet the target, and then they cancelled the Dubs Agreement. Then there is the Vulnerable Persons Resettlement Scheme, and this is only for those from refugees from Syria and a very narrow subsection of those. So again, it's very limited routes, so people have to take what routes they can. Now, one of the main arguments you'll hear for why we need to combat the crossings is to combat human trafficking. And this again is where there's some confusion between what's known as smuggling and trafficking. Now, both are criminal activities and both are run by gangs, and no one's denying that. But trafficking involves somebody being exploited by the traffickers. They are normally taken and then forced to work in various things, quite often illegally, but, well, always illegally, but quite often illegal occupations, or at least in the grey economy. Whereas smuggling is where someone is paying an individual. At the moment, the rough cost is about £3,000 per asylum seeker for the channel crossing to bring them across. And an asylum seeker who has no other choice will pay a smuggler to get them across so they can then seek asylum. If someone is trafficked, the traffickers are unlikely to allow them to seek asylum, because that would then open the traffickers up to being exposed for what they're doing. So they are trapped in this whole hideous situation. Now, what happens when you make routes tougher and more dangerous is you increase the costs that smugglers will charge, because they have to take increased risks. As people can't then afford those, they're forced into the hands of traffickers, which means that as soon as you have started saying, we're going to combat trafficking by making the route harder, you're actually increasing the hold that traffickers have over asylum seekers. And that's something we really need to keep in mind and need to be focused on here. Because if we start blockading the boats, we are going to drive more people into the hands of traffickers. And that is what we need to avoid. That's what we want to avoid. Because nobody is supporting that. Everyone wants to see that trade destroyed. So, but why aren't we just returning people to France? Yeah, people are saying it's a safe country. I've already explained sort of why it might not be, but why aren't we just sending them back? Well, that's illegal. As a signatory to the convention, we are not allowed to carry out what's known as refoulement. Now, the basic principle of human rights law in general, but particularly refugee law, is a principle of non-refoulement. That's where you can't send someone back to a country where they may face danger or feel persecution, or to a country which could then send them on to such a country. Now, with the EU, if someone fails to actually get their asylum claim recognised, they may be sent to Libya, to a refugee camp in Libya. Libya is an active conflict zone, and the refugee camps there have been warned by the UN to focus on modern slavery, torture and murder. So they aren't safe places to be sent back to. That means that as soon as someone has applied for asylum here, or just holds down, I want asylum, the UK government is required to hear that claim. Until they have done that, they cannot send them back by law to France or anywhere else. They need to hear that claim. And the asylum seeker has to be in UK territory or in the territory or jurisdiction of the state that they are applying for asylum in to apply. So you can't apply for asylum in the UK if you're in France. That's why so many people are making crossings here to do so. Now, why aren't they flying? Well, similar reasons. They might not have the documentation. Also, border officials are allowed by law to say, I think that person's going to seek asylum as soon as they land, and block them doing it. So you're going to take another route to try and find that safety. What's the solution then? I mean, if blockading these and making the crossings tougher is going to increase trafficking, how do you reduce it? Well, you open up safe routes. And I know that sounds like you're saying, oh, well, we'll just open the door. It's not. It means that people can have their claims fairly processed. Now, you hear people talk about economic migrants or they're not genuine refugees. Well, you don't know that. You can't know that until you've processed their claim. So by opening safe routes, you can then process those claims effectively. And then it requires investment not just in the UK, but also in France to make sure that we've got the conditions there where we can make sure that we have the ability to process claims for people coming over. It's a two-way street. We need to be looking at both sides of it. There's no point carrying on what we've been doing for decades, Labour and Conservative, just investing money, we're going to make it harder, we're going to make it harder, we're going to make it harder. Because we've seen that doesn't work. Last year we spent £392 million on immigration enforcement for a policy that doesn't work. Now, if we use even just a fraction of that to invest in our local communities here, where we do suffer poverty, where we do have rough sleepers, and we use that money to build up those communities in tandem with supporting refugees, then everyone benefits. And you make sure that you are processing claims and you are dealing with all the issues that could be there. You know who's coming into the country, which seems to be quite a lot of the problems that people have with this. So there are solutions, but they aren't about just closing things down. This is a complex situation. Anyone who tells you there's a simple solution is lying to you. Anyone who tries to explain this in sound bites is lying to you. There are many, many ways that this needs to be dealt with. But if it's not dealt with carefully and it's not dealt with considerately, including to the needs of the asylum seeker, you are just storing up problems for later. You are increasing trafficking and you're increasing the threats to people. So, what we need to be doing is focusing on international law, which means no, we can't just send people back as soon as they arrive. And we need to be focusing on building up both our local communities using some of that money, that £392 million from immigration enforcement, into our communities to build them up so that refugees can also come here and survive. Yes, we can say about housing, but there are 600,000 plus vacant properties in this country. There are 200,000 plus that have been vacant for more than 6 months. There is building land. We use maximum 2% of land in this country for building, and that includes chicken coops. We're also one of the lowest build heights countries in the world. As in, we tend to be about 2 stories. You know, it's quite short houses. London, for example, is one of the shortest in height capital cities in the world. If we look at effective building, and keep in mind we've failed to meet government targets of building for decades as well. If we look to actually increase the building, increase the height perhaps, utilise land better, we don't have a housing problem that way. And we can use some of that 392 million to do that. So there are solutions, but they start with opening safe routes. They start with respecting asylum seekers. They start with recognising that it is not illegal to seek asylum and not illegal to cross the channel. It starts with us starting to show compassion to people instead of fear, instead of demonising them, and instead of trying to use them for political ends. It's not a simple solution. I'm trying to sum up bits here in a quick video. There's too much to cover. But there are solutions. But they do have to focus on humanity. They have to focus on people's needs and why they feel scared, why they need safety, before we start just saying, send them back. Okay? Well, hope that's helped, and thank you very much for listening.